The preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
And through their interaction over the course of a year, we get a feeling for their cognitive profile. We then write what we call a spectrum report. We call the project Project Spectrum. And in this report, which is in plain English, in a couple of pages, we try to describe for parents what the particular intellectual configuration is of their child. And we combine that with concrete suggestions about what they can do with their child at home, at school, and in the wider community in order to, in a sense, nourish the particular set of abilities that the children have. One reason I like the idea of providing a report like this is that in standardized testing, as we all know, you get a score. Your IQ is X, your SAT V is Y, and there's nothing to do with it. You just have the score, and you know you're smart or you're dumb, but that's it. We would like to move away from simply giving test scores to giving concrete suggestions about what to do. And I found myself quoted the other day. I didn't remember saying it, but I actually like the quote. I'm quoted as saying, psychologists should spend less time ranking people and more time helping them. And certainly the impulse behind Spectrum is to try to help people rather than rank them. I might also mention that we're trying to move the same kinds of sensibility to the higher grades. We're hoping to work in the middle school and in the high school in the area of arts and humanities, again trying to come up with a much more naturalistic way of assessing what children learn and not depending so much upon these short answer tests, which whatever value they may have in language and logic are certainly completely inappropriate when you come to the arts. I've actually alluded to the last two educational implications. I think that schools should move increasingly to being what I call educational brokers. By this I mean schools have a hard time even handling the demands of the standard intelligences, because schools are very beleaguered places, as any of you who work in them know. And it's probably unrealistic at this point to think that schools can serve all 7 intelligences or the 20 or 30 competences which we're looking at in Project Spectrum. But I think schools are a logical repository of information, of what's available in communities for children, particularly children who have unusual intellectual configurations. Mentorships, apprenticeships, after-school programs, computer programs, things which kids can do, particularly if they have unusual intellectual capacities. And I think that schools are the logical institution to take this mission. Certainly there's no other institution in sight that I know of that can undertake this task. The final thing I want to mention as an educational implication is that I think we've had much too much focus on tests as the chief way in which to evaluate kids. Now, tests have their purpose, and I'm not in favor of abolishing tests entirely, just about 90%. But I think that schools ought to move much more toward what I call projects. A project is an activity which unfolds over a significant period of time, not days, but weeks, months, perhaps even years. A term paper is an example of a project. It's not a very exciting one, but I mention it just so you can begin to think along the lines that I'm talking about. But in a project, you set up a series of goals and then try to achieve those goals. In the very beginning of the project, you have the option of aborting the project if it looks like it's clearly not going to work. But once a certain amount of time has passed, you're committed to seeing the project through. At that point, you and other people, including peers and elders, begin to evaluate your progress and to give you feedback, and you begin to evaluate your progress on your own. And this happens at various steps along the life of the project until the project has to be completed. Projects have deadlines, because life has deadlines too. And at the end of the project, you have to evaluate it along with these other people. And the very last step is to devise a new project. You don't have to carry out the new project. That's not required. But the project you've done should lead to another project in principle. Projects shouldn't die on the vine. They ought to have, at least in principle, an afterlife. Now, what do projects have over tests? Well, in my view, many intelligences and many combinations of intelligences do not lend themselves to being assessed in the usual short answer, 1 hour at the end of the year format, but they do have a chance to exercise themselves and to be observed in more complex kinds of projects. Projects are also highly motivating, particularly if they're ones you come up with on your own. You stay up late working on them. You get frustrated, but you also get rewarded. You often have to work with other people, and I think that's a positive aspect. They energize you affectively as well as cognitively. Perhaps most importantly, they build up skills in a much more natural way. We all have had the experience of studying very hard for a test, memorizing all the information, doing well, and 3 weeks later it's forgotten. skills that you pick up in the course of projects are much less likely to be forgotten. And I really think that it isn't simply serving my theory to say that many of the things that all of us remember we learned the most from were projects which we undertook when we were young, at school, often outside of school or in the summer or at camp, or later after school in our own occupations. And I would like to see the schools focus much more on projects and much less on tests. It's time now for my 2 thoughts, my 2 minutes on consciousness. You can consider this comic relief if you like, before the grand conclusion. But I did say to myself, when you have a new theory, it's interesting to see whether you can use it to try to explain something which you found mysterious. Now, in the book that I've just completed, The Mind's New Science, I was going to have a chapter on consciousness, because obviously consciousness is such a fascinating aspect of human behavior. But the reason I decided not to is because, in fact, I don't think that any science has much to say about consciousness yet. It's really just too difficult a topic. But I was able, in my thinking about this talk, to come up with 2 lines of reasoning growing out of the theory of multiple intelligences, which I will now toss out. The only defense being that they've never been tried out before, and so you can be the first to see whether they're worth trying out again. First of all, if you're going to talk about consciousness, you have to define it, and that's not an easy task. But I decided to define consciousness as awareness about awareness. Many organisms are aware. We assume that animals are aware. Certainly, higher animals are aware. They perceive things, they notice things, and so on. But I think it's a peculiarly human ability to be aware that you're aware, to be able to sort of sit back and look and say, I am thinking such and such. And I'm going to define consciousness that way, because I think that's the most interesting aspect of consciousness. Now, in order to be able to reflect on your awareness, my argument goes, you have to have a sense of self, because it is the sense of self which steps back and says, there's this agent, namely me, who's perceiving this or observing this or thinking this or so on. So in order to be able to be conscious, you have to have a sense of self. Now, where does the sense of self come from? I submit that only human beings have a sense of self, and that in fact it occurs both for the trivial fact that we are a biological species which has the potential to have a sense of self. That's trivially obvious. But also because we live in cultures where there is talk about selves. If we didn't live in a culture where there was talk about selves, I don't think we would invent the self on our own. That's obviously contentious, but that's my argument. How does the self come to be invented? Well, I claim that it's an emerging ability in children in about the 3rd or 4th year of life, and it emerges because a number of the different intelligences come together. The intelligences involved in a sense of self are obviously intrapersonal, but also interpersonal, because the only way we can know about ourselves is because we can make discriminations about other people. And our discriminations about other people are the ways in which we initially know about ourselves, as anybody who ever watched a child begin to confuse me and you and I and so on will understand. But in addition to having the 2 personal selves, I think that you also need to have a bodily sense and a linguistic sense, because I think a self is tied to some kind of a symbol system, and a logical sense as well, because the self is involved in reasoning. So my first line of argument about consciousness is that it presupposes a self, and the self occurs in us because of the set of intelligences that we have. That's line of argument number 1. Line of argument number 2 goes as follows. You have to have a sense of self to be aware. But what are you going to be aware of? My claim is that the reason people become aware of things is because they get conflicting messages. If we had only one way of representing the world, we would never have any conflict. We'd be like the fish that's the last to discover that it's water, or like Molière's Monsieur Jourdain, who discovered only at the end of his life that he was speaking prose. Conversely, even if we have more than one way of representing information, if all those channels give us exactly the same information, again, we'd be like the fish. But my claim is that because human beings have a lot more intelligences than do other organisms, we encounter a situation where the intelligences present conflicting information. Language tells us one thing, but our sense of our body tells us another, or we feel one thing logically, but another thing kind of emotionally. And these conflicts are what capture our attention. And so my claim, and I will conclude the 2-minute respite with this, is that it's the combination of being able to evolve a self which also detects conflicts among rival sources of information, which is what allows us to be conscious. In conclusion, I've tried to put forth evidence tonight that standard views of intelligence are inadequate and suspect, and that we need to have a new view of intelligence, or as I would say, intelligences, which is based on what we know about the brain and how it's evolved and how the nervous system is ignored. How did that come up? how the nervous system is ordered and arranged. And at the same time that we have to pay attention to the biology, which I think most intelligence testers have ignored, we also have to pay attention to the range of end states which have been valued in different cultures. I think that in many ways we have been very narcissistic in our culture. We have put certain intelligences, particularly the linguistic and logical mathematical ones, on a pedestal. And when I say we, it's particularly psychologists who've had the responsibility for developing tests of intelligence, and that we have inflicted the same kind of myopia on parents and teachers, so that everybody is kind of keyed to look at this one set of abilities, linguistic and logical, and to ignore other kinds of things. And what I'm trying to push for is an awareness that there's a much larger spectrum of abilities which are in fact valued in other parts of the world. And I sometimes talk about our society as having 3 biases, which I will call Westist, Testist, and Bestist. Westist because we're too much in the Socrates tradition, though I'm a great fan of Socrates. We put too many of our eggs on testing of a certain sort. We put too much value in certain kinds of tests, ones that are simply not earned by those tests. And finally, the word bestist is a play on David Halberstam's book about the Vietnam War called The Best and the Brightest, where he talked about how under the Kennedy and Johnson administrations, the thought was that if you got the very best people, which tended to be Harvard faculty members, to Washington, they would really solve all problems. And the result was, among other things, the Vietnam War. But this is actually a serious point, because I think we've bet too much on a certain kind of mind, and that the kinds of problems which we face nowadays in the world are so complex, so varied, involving so many different kinds of cultures and so many different kinds of values, that it's really very, very important for us to give free rein to other intelligences and combinations of intelligences, and particularly those having to do with other people, rather than simply having to do with logical reasoning. I would like to believe that if we broadened our sense of intelligence or intelligences, that not only would we have more people realizing their potential and feeling better about themselves, but they would work better with one another. They might be able to solve more problems, and these solutions might help us to survive and perhaps even to thrive. Now, if those 2 things were to come to pass, survival and thriving, I think we really would have something which we could show those Martian visitors the next time that they come around, and perhaps even more important, we'd be here to greet them. Thank you. I understand now that some of you have written questions, and Laura's going to, I guess, give people who want to leave a chance to leave, and then we would have some discussion for a while.
I'd like to thank you very much for a 7-point talk with 2 minutes of extras at the end. There are quite a number of questions here. I'm just going to wait a minute while people move about and go or use the ladies' room and men's room, etc., and then we'll continue. Okay, we'll start now. Are there limits? Does each individual have a total amount of intelligence which is distributed among these 7 categories? Or does innate intelligence develop, grow, and change during one's lifetime?
There are a number of questions packed in there, and I can't really deal with all of them adequately. My belief is that as part of our genetic structure, individuals do differ from one another in what their potential is in a given intelligence. So given 100 people, if we could measure their musical potential, the potential would not be the same across all people. However, I think as a practical matter, that does not set very interesting limits. And that's because so much of how an intelligence is fostered has to do with the amount of early experience that one has and the kinds of early experience that one has. Now, in Frames of Mind, I spend about a half a chapter discussing the Suzuki method of teaching music, which some of you probably know. Now, Mr. Suzuki is a very clever musician and psychologist living in Japan, and he's devised a program for teaching violin and other instruments to kids. And what's astounding is he takes unselected Japanese kids and their mothers, and both is important, and he gets them to perform at a very, very high level musically by a young age. Now, many people criticize various aspects of the Suzuki method, but that's not material for my point. My point is that if you understand about how people learn things, you can get a kind of performance which would seem prodigious in another setting. Nonetheless, having made that point, I want to make another point, which is that people are differentially at promise or at risk in different intelligence. Now, you all know the medical notion of being at risk. If you have 100 people, probably all of them would get lung cancer under certain conditions, and none of them would get lung cancer under other conditions. But if you put them in the same conditions, let's say ordinary conditions, a certain percentage of them are going to be much more at risk than others. Well, I think the same analogy, though hopefully of a more positive sort, exists in the area of cognition. People are differentially at promise or at risk in an area. So you take 100 kids and you teach them all chess. A few of those kids are going to be playing very well after a few months. Most of those kids will be, what's the word, potzers? And even if they play a lot, they'll never be as good as some of those kids. And that's because the individuals are not equally at promise in the area. This right away raises the educational question, which I know is lurking there. And that is, given that life is finite, and given that if Gardner is right, we don't all have equal potential in every intelligence, should we play to strength? Should we figure out who's at promise in chess or in music and math and force feed them that? Or should we take the other point of view, which is, well, maybe if they're good at that, they ought to have more attention in the areas that they aren't so strong in, the areas where they're more at risk. Now, this question isn't just an academic question, because in Project Spectrum, we are actually going to be describing children's intellectual proclivities, and it's my understanding that already some parents who weren't ordinarily going to give their kids music lessons have started doing it because the test or the assessment says that this kid is at promise in music. But my feeling is that as an educational psychologist, all I can really do is to provide options for people. I can say, look, this is the configuration of abilities that your child has. If you want to nourish what the child is already strong in, you can do this. If you want to nourish what the child is not so strong in, you can do that. Now, why do I feel this, other than from ideological reasons? The reason I feel this is because, in fact, I think that the value systems of different families are going to be very different in this regard. And let me just caricature two contrasting families, and I think you'll know what I mean. If you have a family that's a recent immigrant to this country, doesn't have much money, is very upwardly mobile, chances are that family is going to want to push the area where the child is already strong so the child can fulfill the great American dream. And I think it would probably be a bit inappropriate for anyone to say, no, make your kid well-rounded at all costs, don't push that violin or don't push that engineering. On the other hand, there are many other families who, so to speak, have already achieved the American dream. They know survival is never going to be a real problem. And for those families, what they really want to do is to give the child as wide a range of options with the thought that eventually the child will be able to return to what is his or her strength. My own feeling, what I would be inclined to do for people closest to me, would be to encourage in early childhood the exposure to the widest number of activities, including ones which the child doesn't seem to have much of an inclination for, because I think the brain in the early life is very plastic in the technical sense. It's very flexible, and there's much more of a chance that some early involvement with a relatively alien material will have some effect at that time. As the child gets older, as he or she moves to pre-adolescence or adolescence, I think it is important to discover areas of strength, because those are probably the areas in which the human is going to be most effective. But in giving that kind of advice, I would always preface it the way I did now, perhaps a little bit less pompously, by saying this is what I would do for my kid, but you have to think for yourself what you'd want to do for your child.
Okay, let's see where to go. I'm trying to figure a way to move next. All right. There are many questions which are related, and they have to do with limits of intelligence and total amounts and also aging. And the questions go like this. How does age affect intelligence? Can you be more intelligent as you grow older? Do you lose your intelligence, etc.? Related to that are, can you exercise to increase abilities in one of your 7 intelligences? There's about 6 or 8 questions that are all about those kinds of issues.
I would like to be able to say we're selling that nostrum outside for whoever is interested, but not true. When I talked before about a developmental theory of intelligence, I was being serious, but I was also being promissory. I think intelligences do have their own developmental trajectory. I think language develops different from logic, and logic develops different from spatial, and so on. And the truth is, however, we don't yet know enough about how to study these things to be able to say anything very decisive. You really would have to create a whole new field. Piaget created a field called genetic epistemology, where he tried to understand the development of different scientific concepts like causality, space, and time. You know, Piaget has all these books, The Child's Understanding of X, Y, and Z. I think you'd have to do the same kind of thing with the different intelligences. My own feeling is that in every intelligence at every age, until you reach senility, there will be a chance to enhance it. But obviously, the later you wait, the harder it gets for all kinds of reasons. This makes early development very, very important. One of the reasons we began to work with 3- and 4-year-olds is because we think that's an age at which you can already see differences, but it's also an age in which intervention can make an enormous amount of difference. I think that when you want to go into an area late in life, you really have to use much, much more energy and have much, much more focus than earlier in life, and there are probably lots of different reasons why that's true. There was one other aspect of that which I wanted to touch on. I forget. Sorry, maybe it'll come back again.
The 7 types of intelligence which you describe seem to be culturally bound on some levels, and they seem to be of value in our rationalistic, technologically sophisticated society. Would you use the same model of multiple intelligences in a different kind of society, such as the Bushmen in Africa?
Well, the advantage of that question is reminding me of what I wanted to say before. Remember, earlier during my talk, I said that there were certain aspects which I thought were inadequate in the theory of multiple intelligence, but I wasn't going to talk about them. Well, one of the things which I spent a lot of time thinking about, and I'm going to use the term that you all would use, is wisdom. Because if there's one ability which we think that one associates with older individuals, it is wisdom. How to think about something like wisdom, which seems to be the ability to see the whole picture, is very difficult to think of in terms of a theory of multiple intelligence, which kind of prides itself in having these different modules which may or may not communicate with one another. So what does it mean for someone to be able to see the whole picture? I can make an argument of how that comes out of the theory of multiple intelligences, but frankly, I'm not convinced by that argument myself. So I think I'm not going to make it here. But it's probably the case that the more that things remain the same from one generation to the other, the easier it is for people who have accumulated knowledge to appear to be wise. conversely, and unfortunately, the more a society changes, the more rapidly it changes. And America has always been a rapidly changing society compared to other ones. The less those kinds of abilities are likely to be valued, because so often they seem to be clearly inappropriate. You know, what looked to be appropriate in economics, say, 20 or 30 years ago, just doesn't seem to be true anymore, and so the wisdom doesn't seem to be as applicable. Now, the question you're raising now, what would the Bushmen say? Well, I think you're quite right. In any culture, if they sat around and played this game, they would do it differently than the way I did. Unlike most people who've been interested in intelligence, though, I at least have made the effort to try to understand the kinds of abilities which are valued elsewhere. And I talk about the Bushmen a fair amount in the book, and I talk about all other kinds of pre-literate cultures as well. And the very interest in social kinds of knowledge, and in bodily kinds of knowledge, and in spatial kinds of knowledge, are not the kinds of things which you routinely find about discussions, which you routinely find in discussions of intelligence if you look in a textbook. In fact, I'd be astounded if you found those discussed anywhere. So while I freely concede that I'm not able to step out of my boots either, and I'm going to look at the Bushmen through my limited Western lenses, at least I think one has to try to make that effort. And in working in other cultures, particularly in Japan and China, I have found a lot of interest in the theory of multiple intelligences, and a feeling in both of the societies that the theory articulates more of what the accumulated wisdom in those societies think is important than the standardized tests have. So that's a little bit of a verification, but it's admittedly a verification from a so-called great culture or great civilization, those meaning only in the sense the ones that have a long literate tradition, as opposed to ones like the Bushmen, which may be equally great, but we can't appreciate in the same way because you don't have that accumulated written word.
The theory of multiple intelligences challenges two major American institutions, the schools and the testing establishment. Will they change? Please comment.
Well, anybody who believes they're going to be able to change those institutions has got to have a certain amount of hubris or chutzpah or vision or some combination thereof. I think that it would be foolish to predict that any work, least of all mine, has a high probability of changing any venerable institution in American society. It's very hard for anybody to change things like that. On the other hand, they do change. The schools are not the same as they were 50 years ago. Even the testing organizations aren't the same as they were 50 years ago, though some might say that both are worse. But I do feel it's important to try to enter into a dialogue with these organizations. I'm spending a great deal of time with schools. Schools of all sorts have been very interested in this theory. Interestingly to me, private schools more so than public schools. But I am actually going out to Indianapolis next month, 2 months, where there are a bunch of teachers who are trying to organize a school around the theory of multiple intelligences. And after I got over being flattered at this, I realized that the biggest thing I could do would be to stay out and not to try to influence what they're doing. And they keep saying to me, are we doing it right? Are we doing it right? And I say, you're doing fine. Because I don't see the theory as being prescriptive. In fact, in a certain sense, it goes against the guts of a theory to say you ought to do A, B, and C. What I think of it is a kind of a consciousness-raising thing, not in my 2-minute sense of consciousness, but to make people think about things they haven't thought about before, and they're probably the best judges of how to do that. As for testing, as at least one party in this room knows, the work that we're hoping to carry out in the area of evaluating the arts and humanities is supposed to be carried out with the Educational Testing Service, which is famed and fabled for the SAT. There are people at the Educational Testing Service who I think feel that the days of the SAT are numbered, and they may even feel positively that there are new ways of assessing, which are very, very different from the ones they've done before. And while I'm certainly not going to stop my criticism of any institution that I don't like for a minute, I don't think that precludes working with them so long as you maintain what you believe is right. Once I began to proclaim the theory of multiple intelligences, I got phone calls from many organizations saying, we would like to make up tests for the 7 intelligences. And some of them even offered me things. But the whole notion of the theory is so far away from the way we now think about testing that I don't think in the end any of them would be interested in doing it with us, and I don't think we'd be interested in doing it with them. You know that Karl Marx wrote about the waning of the state should wither away in the ideal of communism. Well, I would like to see the waning away of tests. I hope it's not as visionary as Marx, because I don't hold much likelihood of communism in our imperfect world. But if I could nudge either the schools or the so-called testing organizations to a broader notion of what counts for assessment, I think that would be a very worthwhile thing to do. And I frankly think I have time on my side. There's an organization which has just been formed. It had the wonderful name D-Test, but it was a bit contentious, so they've changed the name to Fair Test. But this is, to my knowledge, the first national organization which is taking as its mission providing information about tests and all the ways in which they're misused, and what it means when those ranking of tests, the SATs going up in Mississippi and not in New York. That's a whole additional story, which is very complicated. But there's so much misinformation about tests and so much misuse about tests that I think simply sharing that information is important. And one of the nicest things about this organization, they're supposed to have their first meeting this fall, is they're not just going to knock at things, which is easy. They're going to have a panel on alternatives to testing, which I think is really what's important, and that's what people like me are trying to do, is to come up with other ways of getting at the same need.
This is on a very different tack. The word disorganized is often used to describe the way some people's minds work. How would you describe this kind of mental state? Cross-intelligence.
Well, I'm not really sure when the person is using the word disordered whether they're talking about pardon me? Disorganized, yeah. I mean, they could be talking about some kind of mental pathology. I mean, the sort of thing which Thomas Sass said doesn't exist 2 weeks ago. I certainly don't feel that the theory of multiple intelligences has much to talk about frank forms of pathology like psychosis. But assuming that this is a less pernicious use of the word disordered is meant, let me throw out a suggestion. I think that people differ a great deal from one another in which intelligence they most naturally bring to the fore, particularly when they're faced with a new kind of problem. When the kind of intelligence that a person favors is different from the one that is favored by others around him, and the person insists on using that intelligence, then she may well strike them as being disordered, even though the person is perfectly capable of using that for his or her own purposes. Let me be concrete. One of the best ways of convincing people of the theory of multiple intelligences is to tell them to take a car ride with somebody who finds his way around in a very different kind of way. The map reader versus the landmark person versus the verbal person. When you start grabbing the map from one another and fighting and things like that. Now, if you're the kind of person who gets up in the morning before the trip and lays it all out and says you go on Route 90 to a certain point and then take a left on Route 9 and so on, you're just driven nuts by someone who says, well, I don't know how to do it, but I'll get there. Now, if people say that, they know what to talk about. I would say they're disordered. But there are many people who do not work in map ways at all, who work much more in terms of landmark or much more in terms of feel. And if it works for them, I think it's an arrogance to call it disordered. By and large, of course, since logic rules the world, particularly in the world that we live in, if you have a logical, mathematical kind of mind, you will not be called disorganized at your workplace. But if you go home and you can't find anything, and you forget to go shopping and things like that, you might. So I guess I don't really have anything very profound to say in this issue, but which is why I talk so long, right? But I think that the one point which might be worth rescuing is that before we dismiss somebody else's way of thinking, we should see if it's serviceable for them. If it's not, then we might want to try to repair it. But if it's serviceable for them, we might want to try to develop some empathy. And you may think that I'm I'm beating a dead horse, because many people who are sophisticated say, well, we know intelligence testing isn't that prevalent. But in fact it is. Most schools use IQ or pseudo-IQ tests which are called aptitude tests, but are basically correlate 0.8 or 0.9 with IQ tests. They use these things to rank kids. And as early as 2nd or 3rd grade, teachers are getting messages about who's a high scorer and he or she is smart, and who's a low scorer and he or she is dumb. And they get streamed. They get treated differently by what's called in psychology the Pygmalion or Rosenthal effect, where even if you tell people who score the same that one is brighter than another, they'll be treated differently. And gifted children programs, about which I know a lot, upwards of 90% of gifted children programs decide on the basis of IQ or IQ-like measures. So if you get 131 IQ, you get in the gifted program. If you get 129, you don't. Now that's a crazy way to make a decision, particularly since people can be highly gifted in areas which do not show up in intelligence tests. So if you feel my wording is a bit severe for what sophisticated understanding of intelligence testing is, it's not severe for what's actually going on in most schools in most parts of the countries today. It's not at all severe for what developing countries are embracing. And when I talked about people like Jensen before, Jensen gets a lot of money from a lot of people who one might not like too much to try to show that you can measure things with brain waves. And the question he's most interested in are racial differences in intelligence. And these, I think, are rather frightening presences on the national landscape, and they're probably worth having some aggressive argumentation against.
There are quite a few questions here that relate to transferability of intelligences and what is a genius. And I guess to extrapolate from what you were just talking about, if somebody is able to map read as easily as they are able to get someplace by landmarks, is that a sign of a different use of intelligence, transferability between multiple intelligences?
People are certainly different from one another in the extent to which they can, number one, do well in different intelligences, and number two, move from one intelligence to the other. And I have no objection if we make these people stand out and say he or she is special because they're good in language and logic and spatial, and they can move from one to the other. However, I don't think those are people who are necessarily picked out by intelligence tests. In fact, the most famous study of people who got high IQs, the so-called Terman study, which was undertaken in California in the 1920s, where they picked out kids who had IQs over 150, ended up showing adults who did quite all right in the world, but essentially nobody who did remarkably. And that itself is very remarkable. So my first point is that there are people who can be good in several intelligences, but those are not necessarily the ones who show up on standardized IQ testing. Being good in a number of intelligences is a very nice skill to have, and it may well suit you for roles which very few other people can carry out. Let's say, for example, being able to run a scientific laboratory. Most scientists are very good in logic. Some of them are good in language as well. If they're not, they try to find somebody to work with who is, because otherwise they can't publish their papers. But very few scientists are also good in dealing with other people. Doesn't mean they're bad, but they don't really like it and it's not their thing. So when you get someone like, let's say, James Watson, who discovered the structure for DNA, who's also a good administrator, that person is very likely to be put in charge of a lab, because the ability to work with other people and discover talent and nourishment is not that common among scientists. So having those sets of skills is very good. I don't think that makes the person a genius, it makes them very good. People who are, let me talk a bit about prodigiousness and genius and creativity. Prodigiousness, to my definition, simply means very rapid advancement in an area. As a rough and ready definition, a prodigy is somebody who essentially has adult performance in an area while still a child. And my colleague David Feldman has recently written a book on this called Nature's Gambit, where he talks about what it means for someone to be a prodigy. Soon to be published by Basic Books, right? And being a prodigy, however, tells you nothing about what the person's ultimate achievement will be. There are people who are prodigies who end up as complete derelicts, the people who are, if anything, slow learners who end up doing tremendous things. I would save the word genius for somebody whose accomplishments as an adult make him or her stand out over a long run and over a wide territory. And sometimes people are geniuses and it's not known until they're old or until after they die. Genius, in other words, is a measure of accomplishment. And you can be a person who has tremendous accomplishment as an adult who could be very non-outstanding as a child. I would tend to collapse creativity and genius in our culture. But there are many cultures which don't value creativity. That is, which really have a lot of difficulty with somebody doing things in an innovative way. In fact, they might kill them, which effectively, I mean, this isn't funny because, well, it's funny, I suppose, but creativity is really, it's a modern Western kind of invention, and there are very few other pockets of the world where creativity has been nourished for very long. So there are certainly geniuses in societies which don't honor creativity, but these people would simply be the people who are the most outstanding in an area, apart from whether or not they're creative. Was there some other part to that question?
I think that was it.
Okay.
This is, again, on a different tack. Where does the experience of religious sensitivity, sensibility, awe, mystery fit into the 7 types of intelligences?
That's a question that's often raised, and my feeling about that is very much like my feeling about wisdom. That is, I don't deny the existence of spirituality any more than I deny the existence of wisdom. But it is difficult for me to be able to think of in terms of the theory of multiple intelligences, so it's really a question that I don't have a good answer for. I think one reason I don't is because spirituality is not something that's been valued very much in our culture, and so I personally, I guess, to be frank about it, not being a terribly spiritual person myself, don't have a lot of sensitivity to it. But in our study of young children at this preschool, we are trying to look for signs of spirituality because we do feel that this is a potential adult end state, even if it isn't valued as much in our culture as it is, say, in India. Having told you I don't really have much to say about spirituality, let me tell you a bit about how we're looking at interpersonal intelligence, because maybe you could see how to look at spirituality. Remember, we've got this classroom, and we're trying to figure out what the profile of abilities is of children, not by giving them a lot of tests, by watching about how they observe, how they interact in the classroom. Now, in the case of music, we have little music things around like Montessori bells, which they can play with, and we sing songs, and so we have little tasks for the kids, and the same for most of the other intelligences. And for a long time, we try to come up with tasks in the area of interpersonal knowledge, or what Dan Goleman is going to call social intelligence. And then we realized that that was really foolish, because the real place that you find interpersonal intelligence is not in special tasks, but just in things which happen ordinarily in the classroom. What happens when a fight breaks out? What happens when the kids get sick? What happens when a new child comes to class? What happens when there's some kind of a problem which kids have to be able to solve together, they can't solve it? So instead of having special tasks, we simply look at things which happen naturally in the class, and we try to figure out 3 different kinds of roles, R-O-L-E-S. One is what we call the leader or the executive. That's the child who somehow is able to get other kids to carry out somebody's will, usually his own, especially with 3 and 4-year-olds. Another one we call the mediator, and that's the person who, when he sees a conflict of some sort, tries to minimize it and to reduce it in some way. And the third we call the caretaker or the empathizer. This is when somebody's hurt. It's the kid who goes over and tries to calm and something and do something like that to make the other person feel better. I don't even know yet whether we're going to succeed in identifying these 3 roles, though I think that that trifurcation is an improvement on interpersonal intelligence alone. I would think that if we were, especially when we get to the person who's a caretaker and a mediator, we might begin to move somewhat in the realm of spirituality. But we still would be a far distance away from that, and I would welcome anybody's sense about how we could get at that. I personally believe, and Feldman, my colleague, believes even more strongly, that there are some kids from a very early age who do have this additional dimension which would have been called beatific some centuries ago. But it's very, very hard to get your hands on, as I guess spiritual implies.
This will be the last question. Would there be any correlation between low intrapersonal intelligence,
Inter or intra?
intrapersonal intelligence, and incidence of neurosis?
I think there probably would be a low correlation between. I think there probably would be a correlation between low intrapersonal intelligence and difficulty in circumventing your neurosis. I mean, neuroses come in all sizes and flavors, and presumably having a fantastically high interpersonal intelligence doesn't ensure that you will be non-neurotic. I mean, who is, after all? But I do think that if you have the potential for gaining a lot of knowledge about yourself, you should be able to do that, to apply that knowledge to minimize your neurotic tendencies or to funnel them in a healthy direction. There are people, therapists will tell you, who absolutely resist the catching on to pathologies in themselves, or who can verbalize it, but who can't go beyond verbalization to a kind of a gut dealing with it. And I suspect that kind of limitation would probably be fatal. How to develop interpersonal intelligence is at least as difficult a question as how to discover spirituality. With older kids, one of the things we're doing is we're having kids put together portfolios of things which they like by other people, whether they're paintings or stories or essays or comments or photographs or whatever, and things of their own which they like, and also sketches and drafts and things like that. And even though that may seem very far away from interpersonal intelligence, we're hoping that by this indirect route we can get kids to begin to think about what it is that they value, what they think it is important, and how in the kinds of things which they produce they can realize some of the things that are important to them. Whether this could ever be applied in an art therapeutic way to neurosis it's a question for another occasion.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.